Okay. Good afternoon to you all in Sarasota, both at TBS and those of you on Zoom, and a very special welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Antony Polonsky, speaking to us from London. We thank you, Dr. Polonsky, for taking time out to be with us, and it's great to have you with us here again. This afternoon's presentation is the final presentation in our Distinguished Speaker Series. This has been extremely successful with an array of excellent speakers who provided us with presentations that have stimulated, informed, educated, entertained, and even perhaps provoked us, all for our common benefit. This series falls under our Program and Education Committee, so I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Ben Sachs, the interim chair, Dr. Isaac Calveria, our previous chair, Al Tridell, and all of those people who have helped us make this such a success. It is with enormous pleasure that Dr. Antony Polonsky addresses us again today. We are so honored and privileged to have you with us. Dr. Polonsky is Professor Emeritus from Brandeis University in Massachusetts and is a world authority on Eastern European Jewry. It gives me pleasure now to ask Rabbi Stuart Altshuler, who's known Dr. Polonsky for a long time and has been a co-leader on previous trips to Eastern Europe, to welcome Dr. Polonsky.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Welcome again, my dear friend. I see Claire just joined us as well. So we have a good contingent from our trip that's coming. And Jordan Wallach is here, is also going to be with us pretty soon. It's always an honor. There's not a moment that I've been with Dr. Antony Polonsky where I haven't learned so much about our past, and in particular about the incredible history of the Jews of Poland and Russia. And every time I have the honor of teaching, as you know, in our history class, we're dealing with a lot of that now, with contemporary Jewish history, the turn of the century, and to try to explain a vast story that most of us don't know about. And there is no one in the world who is the greatest authority on the subject of Polish and Russian Jewish history than my dear friend, who I cherish, Dr. Antony Polonsky. So welcome again, dear Antony.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Stuart. You're also a very good friend of mine, and I'm very glad to be here. And obviously, I don't think that I can live up to the praise that you've showered on me. What I want to talk about today is about the discussion, the controversies which have arisen over Polish-Jewish relations during the Second World War. And I want to concentrate on Poland, partly because we're going to be there within 10 days, but also because I've just come back from the commemoration of the 85th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and this was an event which was rather complicated, and there were both good and bad aspects of it. So I'd like to end with what happened at this event and how we need to go forward from the difficult controversies which arose on that occasion. Now, certainly historical controversies often tend to become extremely acrimonious. In the course of a bitter exchange in the late 1950s, when I was an undergraduate, over whether the English Revolution of the mid-17th century had been caused by the resistance of the aristocracy to the rapidly rising position of the non-aristocratic landed gentry, the economic historian Richard Tawney responded to an attack by the Regius Professor of History at Oxford, Hugh Trevor-Roper, by observing that an erring colleague is not an Amalekite to be smitten hip and thigh. And I think that this is something we should bear in mind when thinking about these controversies. Similarly, during the controversy caused by the publication of Fritz Fischer, the German historian's Griff nach der Weltmacht, the German war aims during the First World War, which argued that Germany bore the major responsibility for the outbreak of that war, the German ambassador to the United Kingdom felt it necessary to approach James Joll, who was sub-warden of St. Anthony's College, where I was then studying in Oxford, to ask him not to offer a visiting fellowship to Fischer. Again, an example, the way in which the intervention of government actors in historical controversies is to be discouraged. What is striking that is in both these cases is that ultimately it proved possible to achieve a degree of consensus which rested on the participants distinguishing between those issues on which they agreed and those which were still disputed. This was more difficult and took longer in the Fischer controversy, which came to involve important aspects of German self-understanding, above all, whether German war aims, as articulated during the First World War, had already been adopted before the outbreak of the war, and the extent to which there was continuity between them and the goals sought by the Nazis during the Second World War. Clearly, the achievement of a degree of consensus is much more difficult when issues relating to national identity and its image are involved. And this can be observed in the disputes which are now very obvious in the United States over how the role of slavery is to be evaluated in American history, over the longue durée, over the conflicts in this country, over how to assess Britain's imperial past, and in the attempts to censor the criticism of the aspects of the history of Hinduism in India, just to give a few examples. The discussion of such disputed aspects of the past has been most successful in those countries where the civic culture has been highly developed and where the tradition of debate resting on the acceptance of the good faith of those with whom one disagrees is well established. These principles have clearly come under attack in recent years with the rise of populism and the undermining of democratic values. This obviously has a number of roots. In the first place, it's a reaction against the Reagan and Thatcher era of marketization and globalization from the 1970s, which has created both winners and losers. In East Central Europe, and we'll be able to observe this in a few days, it's marked by a distaste for those who have profited from the introduction of market reforms after the collapse of communism in the area. It's also linked with the politics which stress the importance of national identity and patriotism. I don't have to talk about or even mention the name of DeSantis here. Everywhere from Trump's America to Kaczynski's Poland and Bolsonaro's Brazil, it's a reaction against so-called liberal elites, which are perceived by their opponents as lacking in patriotism. And linked with this has been a panic fear about immigration and the associated xenophobia. It's also clear that the new legitimacy that authoritarian regimes enjoy, from Putin's Russia to Xi's China, have undermined the attractiveness of the liberal democratic model in much of the developing world. It's not yet clear how this will be affected by Russia's intervention in Ukraine, and clearly a lot will rest on whether this actually can be defeated, who will come out on top in this war. And although one can argue about the past, or at least I have some doubts about my ability to interpret the past. My ability to interpret the future is much more limited. In this situation, it's not surprising that the debate about the reaction of Polish society to the mass murder of the Jews initiated by the Nazis in occupied Poland should have proved so controversial. And these arguments go back to the Nazi occupation itself. Emanuel Ringelblum, the creator of the underground archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, which we'll be going to see when we go to Warsaw, in a book which he wrote, Polish-Jewish Relations During the Second World War, he wrote this book in a bunker hiding in Warsaw. Ultimately, he was denounced by his neighbors and was murdered. He's a remarkable individual, but how he could write this major work under these conditions is astonishing. He posed the following question in 1943. Last summer, that's in 1942, when the mass deportation of Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto took place, when carts packed with Jewish men, women, and children moved through the streets of the capital, did there really need to be laughter from the wild mobs resounding from the other side of the ghetto walls? Did there really need to prevail such blank indifference in the face of the greatest tragedy of all time? In an even more barbed query, he conceded that given their limited agency in the face of the German occupation, the Polish people, I quote him, the Polish people and the government of the Republic of Poland, that's the government in exile in London, were incapable of deflecting the Nazi steamroller from its anti-Jewish course. But the question is permissible whether the attitude of the Polish people befitted the enormity of the calamities that befell the country's Jewish citizens. I ask you to just remember these words because they are relevant in some of the controversies which have arisen in Poland in the last 2 weeks. Ringelblum's views are echoed in Czesław Miłosz's poem, A Poor Christian Looks at the Ghetto, written in 1944. In this poem, Miłosz imagines the destruction of the ghetto as the first stage in the end of the world, an apocalypse in which he himself will be buried alive. Worse than the fear of this terrible death is another fear. Under the earth, he imagines a mole, the guardian of the underworld, who has clearly Jewish features, who makes his way scrutinizing the corpses he finds. From the spectrograph of his body, he will be able to identify the poet, Miłosz. And this is the last words of the poem. And he will count me among the helpers of death, the uncircumcised. The way the debate in Poland has developed up to around 2015, particularly since the negotiated end of communism in 1989-91, gave rise to a degree of optimism. The issue was a matter of public discussion, but with the publication of an article by a Polish literary critic, Jan Polonsky, The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto, in January 1987, a new level was reached. In this article, Polonsky called on the Poles to accept some degree of responsibility for the fate of their Jewish fellow citizens under Nazi occupation. This guilt did not consist, in his view, of involvement in the mass murder of the Jews, in which he claimed the Poles did not participate significantly. Other people have taken a different view. It had two aspects. In the first place, there was the Poles', quote, insufficient effort to resist, their holding back from offering help to the Jews. And this was the consequence of the second aspect, that the Poles had not, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, created conditions in which the Jews could be integrated into the Polish national community. He concluded, if only we had behaved more humanely in the past, had been wiser, more generous, then genocide would perhaps have been less imaginable, would probably have been considerably more difficult to carry out, and almost certainly would have met with much greater resistance than it did. To put it differently, it would not have met with the indifference and moral turpitude of the society in whose full view it took place. The controversy over Polonsky's article revealed that the desire to come to terms with the more problematic aspects of the Polish Jewish past was still to be found only within a minority of the Polish intelligentsia and was certainly not shared by the society as a whole. Polonsky's position was criticized strongly from people both who supported the communist regime, which was still in power, to the right wing of Solidarity. Many accused Polonsky of playing into the hands of Poland's enemies and of endorsing anti-Polish propaganda. The parameters of the debate in Poland in the 1990s seem to have been set by Polonsky and his critics. At the same time, two new developments stimulated a more fundamental thinking of the attitudes towards Jews and the Jewish question. The first was the large mass of historical material produced after 1989 when censorship was relaxed. This provided a much fuller picture of Polish-Jewish relations in the 20th century, showing clearly how desperate the situation of the Jews had become by 1939, with the majority of Polish society and Polish political parties now adopting the position that the, in quotation marks, solution of the Jewish question, in quotation marks, was the voluntary or compulsory removal of most Jews from Poland. The second important development was the emergence of some new Polish Jewish writers and the more widespread distribution in Poland of the works of already established Polish Jewish writers. By this I mean people of Jewish origin who wrote in Polish, a phenomenon which has continued up to the present day, and we'll be discussing it when we go to Poland. The 1990s were marked by an outburst of creativity by people like Hanna Krall and Henrik Greenberg, and the publication of important new writers like Wilhelm Dichter and Michał Głowinski, all of them available also in English, who dealt extensively with their previously considered Jewish backgrounds. All had in common their experience in the war as children hidden on what was called the Aryan side, the other side of the ghetto, and their maturing into adults in the complex post-war years. Their work gave a graphic and largely negative picture of what it was like to be a Jew in a hostile environment, both during the war and under communism. And this was the context for the debate provoked by the publication of American historian of Polish origin. His father was Polish, but his mother, his father was Jewish, but his mother was Polish. His father came from a well-known Krakow family, and he was sheltered by his mother during the war. They fell in love and eventually got married. So he came from a mixed background, which of course was reflected in his views. He published his study as Neighbors in English in 2001, and previously had published it in Polish in 2000. On the basis of the evidence which was produced for a trial in Poland in 1949, the book described in detail an incident in the town of Jedwabne in the northeast of today's Poland, in which, with some German incitement, but little actual involvement, the local population brutally murdered the overwhelming majority of its Jewish neighbors, at least 1,000 and maybe as many as 1,600 people. The 600 of them were were imprisoned in a barn, which was then set on fire. The debate on Jedwabne was the most serious, protracted, and profound on the issue of Polish-Jewish relations since the end of the war. It confirmed the existence of two basic positions among the historians in Poland, and this remains the case today. A self-critical one, willing to accept Gross's basic conclusions, even with some modifications, and a more apologetic one, seeking to explain and excuse Polish behavior. And the same division was evident in response to Gross's two subsequent books, Fear, which described anti-Jewish violence in Poland after the Second World War, and Golden Harvest, which describes how looters attempted to find Jewish valuables on the terrain of the former death camps. Gross's work has stimulated a new school of Holocaust historians in Poland at the Center for the Study of the Jewish Holocaust in Warsaw. The head of this is a woman called Barbara Engelking. I would point out that although she has what sounds like a Jewish name, Barbara Engelking is a Pole of Catholic origins, although her religious beliefs have been somewhat modified. They concentrate on what they describe as the final stage of the Holocaust in Poland, which took place after the initial killings carried out by the German armed groups, the Einsatzgruppen, and the liquidation of the ghettos in the larger towns. In the smaller towns of Poland, the ghettos were more porous and many Jews were able to escape from them. One of the historians of the school argues that as many as 200,000 Jews were able to escape. However, Polish-Jewish relations in these towns were more distant before the war. The Jews who sought shelter among the local population often did not find it, and less than 50,000, according to Szpikowski's estimate, survived until the end of the war, hunted down by the German occupying authorities and often betrayed by the local population. In some well-documented cases, they were even murdered by the main Polish resistance, the Home Army. Two leading members of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Jan Grabowski, who's based in Canada, like Jan Gross, he comes from a mixed background. His father was Jewish, but his mother was not. And Barbara Engelking, who I've already described, assembled a team to investigate how the policy of mass murder was implemented in a select number of districts in Nazi-occupied Poland. This was published in a major two-volume study, 1,700 pages. It's called, in Polish, in English, The Night is Still Far Off, The Fate of Jews in Selected Counties of Occupied Poland. There's also been considerable debate between the more apologetic and more self-critical historians in Poland on the evolution of the number and the motivation of those Poles who risked their lives to save Jews. Although some valuable work has been done on this, been done on this before 1989, the official line, particularly after 1968, stressed the high number of rescuers, downplayed the fact that their actions were often disapproved of by society, and failed to distinguish between the different character of rescuers, protectors, and helpers, or examine their motivation. Some were motivated purely by monetary considerations, others by the sexual attraction which the people that they were hiding aroused in them. In the debate over Gross's book, his critics frequently alluded to the over 6,300 Christian Polish rescuers of Jews who have so far been honored by the Yad Vashem Memorial Institute in Jerusalem. They claimed that this figure was only a fraction of the total number. Thus, one of them, Martin Urinovich, basing himself on the numerical estimates made by Gunnar Paulsen of Jews who survived in wartime Warsaw, which many scholars have argued are exaggerated, asserted that there were 400,000 Christian Polish rescuers of Jews in the country as a whole. These historians have also frequently alluded to the heroic actions of people like Irena Sendler, whose organization saved perhaps 2,000 Jews, or mostly children, in Warsaw, and the Ulma family in Markowa in the Rzeszów district of Poland, who were murdered by the Germans along with the Jews they were sheltering. We'll be able to see the monument to Irena Sendler when we go to the Jewish to the museum, Polin Museum in Warsaw. The apologetic character of much of this research has led to attempts to place the situation of the rescuers in the larger historical context, stressing how they were frequently regarded with hostility by the surrounding population and pointing out the often complex character of their motivation in providing resistance. Researchers also elucidated the complex situation in the Rzeszów district, where the Ulma family were murdered, where subsequent to their murder, a large number of families who were hiding Jews handed them over to the Nazis or the Polish police, or in some cases even murdered them. This issue is still one of the major subjects for scholarly research, and this research is still going on. But the tendency, I think, is to show how resistance, hiding of Jews was a somewhat marginal phenomenon, that those who undertook this, which was of course punishable in Poland by death, and there were at least 1,000 death sentences for people who hid Jews, the Ulmas were just one example, but that this was a rather marginal phenomenon, and indifference or indeed assistance to the Germans was more common. What has become clear in these debates, and this is true also in the debate in Lithuania, which I haven't had a chance to allude to, but I will obviously be coming to confront this when we go to Vilnius, is that the adoption, planning, and implementation of the policy of mass murder of the Jews was the work of the Nazi leadership and of the German people, who, for the most part, willingly or unwillingly, followed their lead. At the same time, the Nazis gave considerable incentives, both political and material, to those who participated in this genocide, and brutally punished, as I've said, sometimes by death, those who attempted to assist their Jewish neighbors. In looking at this problem, I think it's helpful to compare the responses of the different national groups of the area to the anti-Jewish genocide: Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. In addition, these groups, all of them, unlike the Jews, for the most part saw themselves as fighting two occupying forces during the Second World War, the Nazis and the Soviets. Indeed, many of them regarded the Soviets as a more dangerous enemy. For the Jews, in spite of the reservation of many Jews at Soviet policy, the Soviets provided an opportunity to survive, and they therefore had no choice to support them. Of the nearly 400,000 Polish Jews who survived the war, more than 3/4 survived in the Soviet Union, to which they'd either been deported or fled after the outbreak of the war. Clearly, in investigating these difficult problems, we should make use of careful and detailed research based on archives and reliable first-hand testimony. Unfortunately, this approach to history has been challenged on political grounds, particularly since the coming to power of a populist government in Poland in 2015. They have claimed that it unjustifiably blackens the reputation of Poland. Poland should get up off its knees, they argue. And it's also been complicated by the attempt to use the law to resolve these issues. A good example is the legislation passed by the Polish Parliament in late January 2018, amending the law on the prosecution of crimes against the Polish nation, which had been passed much earlier. The most controversial of these amendments held that, quote, "Whoever claims publicly and contrary to the facts that the Polish nation or the Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes committed by the Third Reich, as specified in Article 6 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, enclosed to the International Agreement for the Prosecution and Punishment of Major War Criminals, or for other felonies that constitute crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, or whoever otherwise grossly diminishes the responsibility of the true perpetrators of the said crimes, shall be liable to a fine or imprisonment for up to 3 years." Now, this legislation evoked strong opposition, and in a surprise move at the end of June 2018, the Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki introduced legislation in the Polish parliament which significantly modified the amendments to the law. The sentences that I quoted were now removed, and the following clause was retained. Protecting the reputation of the Republic and the Polish nation shall be governed by the provisions of the Civil Code. A court action aimed at protecting the Republic of Poland or the Polish nation's reputation may be brought by a non-governmental organization within the remit of its statutory authorities. In addition, clauses relating to the penalization for the denial of crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists and members of the Ukrainian units collaborating with the Third Reich remained in the legislation. This has become a dead letter now because of the close relations between Poles and the Polish government and indeed the Polish population and the Ukrainians fighting for their independence against Russia. The amendment of the legislation was accompanied by a joint statement by Prime Minister Morawiecki and the then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. In it, they condemned every single case of cruelty against Jews perpetrated by Poles during World War II, and also noted the heroic acts of numerous Poles, especially the righteous among nations, who risked their lives to save the Jewish people. In addition, it declared, we have always agreed that the term Polish concentration camps and death camps is blatantly erroneous and diminishes the responsibility of the Germans for establishing these camps. You can argue about this agreement, but I think it made good sense in this particular context. It did not, however, resolve the dispute. And the divisions that had been created by the dispute returned when a libel action was brought in February 2021 in the Warsaw District Court by the 79-year-old Filomena Leszczyńska, supported by a right-wing foundation, the Reduta Dobrego Imienia, the Redoubt for the Good Name of Poland. It was alleged that in the book which I've described, Night is Far Off, Barbara Engelking, who I've already mentioned several times, who was the director of the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Holocaust in Warsaw, and Jan Grabowski, but as Barbara Engelking as an author and Jan Grabowski as the editor of the volume, she claimed that they'd libeled her uncle, the late Edward Malinowski, the mayor of a small village of Malinowo, located near Białystok in northeastern Poland, claiming that he had been implicated in the roundup of Jewish citizens in his district. I would point out here that American libel law doesn't really work very well, but English libel law, which is a much more impressive form of dealing with falsehoods in public life, only applies to living people. You cannot, under English law, libel the dead, but under Polish law you can, and of course this gives rise to all sorts of problems. Referring to one paragraph written by Barbara Engelking, Leszczyńska, the niece of the mayor, who is no longer alive, claimed that it was not true that her uncle had defrauded a fugitive Jewish woman, Estera Drogicka, or that he had assisted in the rounding up and murder by the German occupation of a group of about 20 Jews who were hiding in a nearby forest. At his trial in August 1949 for collaboration, he was in fact acquitted, and here he had admitted to participating in the roundup, but denied involvement in the murder. Drogicka had spoken in Malinowski's defense, possibly under coercion, but had accused him of these actions in a long testimony that she gave in 1996 to the Shoah Foundation. Explaining this discrepancy, Drogicka said, when the war ended, he would have been sentenced to death. I saved him in spite of the fact that he did much harm to me. It seems she felt some gratitude to him because he helped her to pass as a non-Jew and sent her to Germany as a forced laborer, thereby saving her life. It's an interesting example of the complexity of rescue. A man who was probably an anti-Semite who participated in the roundup and ultimate death of Jews also saved this particular woman who both defended him in the courts when he was accused of these crimes, but subsequently denounced him in an oral testimony. The lawsuit was clearly intended to discredit the book, and the plaintiff won her action in the lower court. This decision was overturned in August 2021 in the appeal court, where the judge, Joanna Wiśniewska-Sadomska, held that interference in scholarly research is not the responsibility of the courts. In this situation, in the opinion of the appeal court, to evaluate or reject the scholarship involved as is demanded by the plaintiffs, would constitute an unacceptable interference in the freedom of scholarly research and speech. I should add here that the courts in Poland have been independent in the past, but they are now, as in the United States, under strong attack from the political right, which is attempting to take them over. But that's another aspect of the struggle for democracy. She went on, it cannot be ruled out that the results of this research are not free from mistakes of fact or interpretation. However, these cannot be the basis for a decision in this matter. A courtroom is not the appropriate place for conducting a historical debate. The body which supported the good name of Poland, the Reduta Dobrego Imienia, appealed the case to the Polish Supreme Court, which has, of course, now been taken over by the right. But it was only the death of Filomena Leszczyńska in October 2021 that caused the appeal to lapse. At her funeral, the government's ministry plenipotentiary in matters concerning Polonia, that is Poles outside of Poland, said, Poland is grateful to Filomena Leszczyńska. She is a heroine of our times. Today, fortunately, we don't need to defend Poland with a gun. Today, as a patriot of the 21st century, it's enough to fight for truth and the good name of our country. And it's not surprising that I just want you to remember that one of the participants in this, one of the plaintiffs in this libel action was, of course, Barbara Engelking, and one could certainly anticipate these sort of actions being continued. It's clear that we need to find some common ground in this particular problem. And the fact is that the conflict is not primarily over the interpretation of the often disputed facts relating to the Nazi occupation. It's more deep-rooted, and it reflects a clash between two views of society. One sees society as made up of different and often competing groups in which understandings of the past may differ, and in which a reckoning with the negative aspects of national history is necessary for building a pluralistic, outward-looking, and tolerant polity. Of course, you can give similar examples in the United States. The other is centered on the nation and the community of which it is composed, which is seen as primordial and transcending the transient individuals of which it's composed. As Pierre Nora has claimed, this can be framed as a conflict between history and memory. In the Polish case, it's why the ruling Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, Law and Justice Party, for which it is the biography of the national community and the source of traditions and values that hold everything together, sees this as so important. In its view, historical policy, and I'm quoting here from the Institute of National Memory, which has been taken over by the Peace Party, historical policy refers to the interpretation of facts, lives and events, and is assessed according to the interests of the society and the nation as an element that has a long-range character and constitutes the foundation of state policy. The issue is therefore not historical truth as such. Instead, history is important because it is the long-range foundation of the state. DeSantis could easily be quoted as saying similar things. It's those stories the community tells and retells in order to establish a bond between generations and to teach young people what we believe, one of those factors that must never be contested or debated. It should be stressed that there is some common ground between these two understandings of how history should be written. And I mean, I've always tried to stress this common ground. It's important, therefore, not to demonize the historians of which one disapproves. There is clearly, I think, a role for both for patriotic history, which celebrates the achievements of the nation, and for one which points out to the mistakes and wrongdoings which have been committed in the past. And this brings me to my conclusion, which relates to the commemoration of the 85th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I took part in this, I went to this, although obviously, one has some reservations about what would be said on these occasions. And I have to say that this was a very mixed occasion. It was like the curate's egg, which, as you'll remember, when the curate was asked what the egg was like, which he'd been given for breakfast by one of his wealthy parishioners, he said, it was good in parts. Now, an egg that's good in parts is not something that you would want to eat. So obviously I think that it was more negative than positive. Let me first stress the positive aspects of what took place. This event took place after the invasion of Ukraine. And after Polish civil society expressed considerable sympathy for the Ukrainians struggling against Russian imperialism, and in which the Polish government was one of the principal NATO powers which supported the Ukrainian struggle. Certainly the positive attitude towards the Ukrainians has changed many attitudes in Poland. When asked in Israel to explain why, after the deep conflicts in the past, which have divided Poles and Ukrainians, there was the Poles were oppressed Ukrainians throughout the 19th and early 20th century, and during the Second World War, there was a massacre of Poles by Ukrainians in both Volhynia and East Galicia. When asked to explain in Israel why, given these conflicts, Poles have welcomed the refugees in the way they have, the Nobel Prize-winning author Eva Tokarczuk, who, as her name suggests, is probably of Ukrainian origin, observed that this was because they were seen as people rather than Ukrainians. And clearly, this empathy in relation to the Ukrainians could also be extended to Polish-Jewish relations, and in some cases has been. And it's important to note that at Easter, the primate of Poland, Cardinal Risch, talking about Polish-Ukrainian relations, said, "Musimy przebaczyć I przeprosić." We have to forget or forgive and forget. Now, whether the same formula of forgiving and forgetting, which obviously applies better to Poles and Ukrainians, since there's a lot of wrongs on both sides, can be applied to Poles and Jews, I have a little doubt. But I mean, I think that, we are not without faults. I mean, and there are some things that we have done about which maybe we should feel bad. The role that we played as intermediaries of the nobility in oppressing the peasantry. I had my great-grandfather was a noble, was an agent of the Count Baczynski in Lithuania, and he lost his job when the young Count Baczynski took over and said, "I don't want you to go on oppressing the peasants in the way my father did." Well, so, but this is not the right formula, but it certainly shows how one can move forward. So some aspects of the commemoration were impressive. There was a public recognition of the importance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in front of the monument put up by Edward Natanson out in front of the Polin Museum. And some of the speeches made were extremely eloquent. Marian Turski, a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp, President Duda, Mayor Trzaskowski, the mayor of Warsaw, who talked about how Jews had been an integral element in the society of Warsaw and how much their disappearance had harmed Poland. And also, on this occasion, President Herzog was invited, made a very moving speech, and the president of Germany, President Steinmeier, was also invited and made a moving speech. This was a fine ceremony. It was marred only by the fact that at the end, it was a military ceremony. About 20 minutes were devoted to various military statements where the military presented arms commemorating and honoring the various people. And of course, they were all named, and a huge list of names of people who had assisted Jews during the Second World War. Now, as I've said, and I've tried to point this out, these people are people who should, under all circumstances, be honored, people who were prepared to risk their lives to save Jews, but they were not the majority of society, and they cannot be used as an excuse for those people who did not save Jews. In this sense, the righteous became an excuse for the unrighteous, but the essential ceremony was positive. But the rest of the events were more problematic. And this is for two reasons. One, the government has continued to pursue a policy of apologetics, the historical policy which sees Poles as, above all, heroes and victims, and that those people involved in the mass murder of the Jews were essentially a marginal phenomenon, not really Poles. And this was reflected, for instance, in the way in which agreement was reached between the Polish government and the Israeli government over the re-establishment of the March of the Living. This was a very good development. 10,000 people participated in the March of the Living. It was a very moving event. They were everywhere when I was all over Warsaw as well. And this was really a step forward. But in order to reach this agreement, the government of Israel, this is the government of Netanyahu, agreed that it was desirable that those people on the March of the Living should be made aware of Polish suffering. Nobody can object to that, and should therefore go to a number of museums. And then some of the museums, like the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, are museums about which one doesn't have reservations, but a number of them are not. Just to give 3 examples. The museum which was established in Markowa, commemorating the Ulma family, whom I've described, who are clearly heroes, does not have anything to say about the fact, as I pointed out, that when the Ulma family were murdered by the Germans, all of the other people hiding Jews proceeded either to get rid of their Jews in various ways or indeed murder them. Secondly, there's a monument at the Treblinka concentration camp to a person who is supposed to have provided water to the Jews. If he provided water, he did it for money, and there's a lot of question marks about whether he even provided water. Similarly, there is a monument to a man called Kurash. His pseudonym is Ogien, Fire, who was one of the so-called cursed soldiers, people who continued to struggle against the communist regime after the establishment of communism in 1945, and who saw this regime in many cases as a Jewish regime, and who murdered not only Jewish communists, but also Jewish people who had nothing to do with communism. Now, this is merely recommended, but it didn't come, but still, this, I think, gave to the Polish people in the Polish government who thought like this, a belief that they could really continue to pursue this historical policy. And this takes place also at a time when a parliamentary election is due sometime in the late summer. And this has also led to the pursuit of various rather populistic policies by the government. For instance, a new book was published in the Netherlands claiming that Pope John Paul II had closed his eyes to the sexual abuse within the church. There's probably a lot of evidence for this. But this was picked up by the Polish government and by its spokesman, and they said, our Pope is being attacked by Jews, Freemasons, and people who aren't really Poles. And the nature of this campaign has been very vicious. Similarly, the question of what happened when the plane crashed in Smolensk, bringing the president of Poland and 93 other leading politicians and civil servants to say mass at Katyn, where Poles had been murdered by the Soviets during the Second World War. This was clearly, in my view, an accident caused by the then President Kaczynski's determination to get to Smolensk and get to Katyn, and his pressure, which he put on the pilot, to land in very difficult conditions. But the government is determined to prove it was the result of a bomb on the plane planted by Putin, who, of course, they're encouraged to some extent by Zelensky in this respect, but aided by the then Prime Minister of Poland, Donald Tusk, who is, of course, the leader of the opposition, quite conveniently, and who is also now being put on trial for allegedly importing Russian coal and therefore making Poland too dependent on Russia. At the same time, we also have this demand for reparations from the Germans. Now, the Poles have been provided with a fair amount of money from Germany, and also they've incorporated much of Eastern Germany. My response to this demand for reparations is Szczecin and Wrocław, that is Stettin and Breslau, are these not enough? But at the concert on the second night of the commemorations, the Minister of Culture, in the presence of the German President Steinmeier, demanded reparations and said, I have a book here which shows how much we should be given. Today was a meeting at the Polish embassy, or at least a party at the Polish embassy, to commemorate May the 3rd, the day on which the first Polish constitution was promulgated in 1792, the second written constitution in the world. And here again, the Polish Minister for Relations with the EU was present, and he again, in the presence of the German ambassador, demanded reparations. I had the opportunity on this to ask the German ambassador what he thought about this, and he did say, I don't regard this as helpful. And I said, well, of course, the same was said to Steinmeier in Warsaw. He said that was even less helpful. And this is my view. So we are seeing two things happening simultaneously. And that is related to the whole Ukrainian conflict and the fact that there is a degree of fatigue over the Ukrainian conflict, which is reflected in the fact that a few days ago, as you probably noticed, the Poles banned the import of Ukrainian agricultural products into Poland, which were undermining the position of the Polish peasantry. This is, of course, related to the coming election. This has been now slightly modified. The EU is going to transport these goods through Poland and not allow them to be sold in Poland. But this gives some indication of the situation. So where are we? I think that in looking at these problems, I should also say that the most unpleasant aspect of all of this was there is a new temporary exhibition which we'll be able to see at the Polin Museum. This exhibition describes the situation of the 50,000 odd people in the Warsaw Ghetto who were hidden in bunkers when the ghetto uprising broke out in April 1943. They were clearly assisting in the sense that people came into the bunkers, but they were also casualties of what was going on. And their role has not been that much investigated. Barbara Engelking, whom I mentioned already, and people should know who this is, was the principal curator of this very fine exhibition, which has accumulated a lot of material describing the people who were in these bunkers, at least 16 memoirs and a lot of photographs, some of which were taken by a Polish firefighter who was obviously sympathetic to the Jews, who took photographs of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Barbara Engelking was asked to describe this exhibition on the opposition, on the channel of Polish television, TVN, which supports the opposition. The main television channels are very pro-government. And in this program, she said that the Jews in the bunkers knew what to expect from the Nazis. They knew that the Nazis were their enemies, but they were disappointed by and large in the reaction of Polish society. They expected more sympathy and more help. I've documented from Ringelblum and from Milosz that this is clearly a widespread view. This was then attacked by the Prime Minister. This is an anti-Polish view. This is a view of a person who is not really part of our society. It was attacked by the Ministry of Education, Czarnek, who then threatened to close down this institute. Will not provide finance for anti-Polish propaganda. I could go on, but this is the worst aspect. There's a strong reaction. I mean, I've also signed a letter in support of Barbara Engelking, as a number of other people have. You can find, if you go online, do Barbara Engelking controversy, better put it in Polish controversia. I mean, probably it's only good for people who have some involvement to sign it, but anybody who wants to can also sign this letter. But this is an alarming situation. And what I would say in conclusion is that one should not underestimate the strength of the patriotic view of the past. Every society is sustained in past by its collective memory. The shared repository of images and narratives is preserved and transmitted in the home and at school, at museums, parks, and commemorative sites, in public ritual, pronouncements, and folklore, and through documentaries, popular entertainment, and now, of course, through the social media. And this is what we're fighting against. It's not only us. I mean, I'm a minor foot soldier in this. It's people like Barbara Engelking, people living in Poland, people who are attacked every day and get 2,500 emails every day attacking them as traitors. And it's those people that we should be supporting. And that's why, even though this is an unpleasant situation, we need to go to Poland as we do to Lithuania. I think that, just in conclusion, I think that it's obvious, but sometimes it's good to state the obvious. I think that we need to pursue an approach which will find a larger audience for what we're trying to do. The goal is to show how similar situations give rise to similar reactions. This is not, that is to say, if you have a genocidal regime in power, there are going to be some people who are going to collaborate with it. It's not a question of unique national guilt. I think it's also important to conceptualize what is happening. And we need an integrated history as practiced by Charles Friedlander. We need to answer the more moderate critics of what we can describe as critical history, who see it as devoting excessive attention to the dark past. We need to study the dark past, but we also need to say, to give people I mean, Poland, you can't say you're just first, I mean, the dialogue based on the principle, first admit you're a bunch of scoundrels, then we'll talk to you, is not going to work. It doesn't require much imagination to see why. So just in conclusion, our goal should be to encourage scholarship based on a wide range of sources from a variety of points of view and in different locations, which will ultimately make possible to make it possible to integrate the history of the Holocaust into the larger issue of the successes and failures of Jewish integration in the history of Europe, and will strengthen civic society and democratic values in Poland, in Ukraine, in Lithuania. This is a tough goal. We cannot, I mean, I'm more pessimistic about it now after having been at this commemoration. On the other hand, there are wonderful people who are pursuing this goal in Poland, and there are a lot of them, and we need to support them. Let me just say in conclusion that I quoted Czesław Miłosz's poem where he described how he saw himself as one of the uncircumcised, the makers of death. He wrote another poem, Campo di Fiori, which he described how Giordano Bruno was burned for heresy in Rome, and the people around merely watched with indifference, went on doing what they were normally doing, eating, drinking, selling goods. And he concluded his poem as follows: those dying here, and he's referring here to the people in the Warsaw Ghetto, the lonely, forgotten by the world. Our tongue has become for them the language of an ancient planet, until when all is legend and many years have passed, on a new Campo di Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word. We need to provide this poet's word, but we can't wait for many years. We need to do it now. Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Polonsky, for such a comprehensive and informative presentation. We're now going to move on to our Q&A session. Please remain muted until you're called upon. If you have a question, we'll take questions from the chat room, and also raise your hands. If you haven't put it into the chat room, raise your hands, or if I can't see your image because some of the squares are blacked out, use the electronic hand as well. So I'm going to start off looking at the chat room, and the first is a comment from David Smiga, which I will read out to you. I agree with your comments on the obstacles of the Polish government. My parents were from Plock and spent 5+ years in the camps. Their town of Plock had 9,000 Jews before the war, and 125 survived. My comment is it took 3 years and countless dollars to simply obtain their Polish birth certificates. This was necessary for pension and social security. So this is a comment from David Smiga.
Well, let me just say, you know, Edmund Burke once said, who can draw up a bill of indictment against a whole people? By the way, he was referring there to the Americans. It's impossible. I think that Israel Gutman always said, I hate it when people talk about the Poles, because that's the way they talked about the Jews. This is a country of, it was today 27, 28 million. There are all sorts of people there. I'm tempted to say that the Poles are like the little girl in the nursery rhyme. You'll remember that when she was good, she was very, very good. And I want to conclude this. So there are all sorts of behaviors. And I've spent a lot of time in Poland. I studied in Poland. I mean, if you speak Polish, you encounter all sorts of opinions. I mean, you encounter some strange opinions. For instance, I had somebody come up to me and said, my name is Polonsky, and my family took this name from a Polish Napoleonic family of Polish military, one of whom had been a Napoleonic marshal in the Duchy of Warsaw. And this character came up to me and said, I'm very glad to meet you because my name is Polonsky, and I think we must be related. And I never realized that I had Jewish origins, and I'm really glad to have these Jewish origins. So I had to say to him, you know, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but you probably are one of these noble Polonskys from which my family regarded as a benefactors. And if you look up in the Herba Szlachty Polskie, which is the Polish equivalent of Debrett, you know, the list of people in the Polish in the English nobility, you'll find who they are. And he wrote to me subsequently saying, it was very interesting to find out who my family really were, but I'm still sorry that I'm not actually Jewish. So there are all sorts of attitudes. And I mean, Barbara Engelking, I feel badly about Barbara Engelking because, of course, she spoke to the small, I was acting as the historical advisor to a group of friends of the Polin Museum. And we went to the Polin Museum and she took us around this exhibit. And at the end, I made a speech saying, you know, what wonderful things she had done and how important the work that she was carrying on. And, you know, she came up and said, Antony, you know, I don't deserve this praise. But of course, you know, 2 days later, she's the subject of these terrible attacks. So it's a complicated story, and it takes a long time for people to come to terms with these terrible traumas. The Poles witnessed mass murder in their country. Not only did they, as Mr. Smiegels pointed out, I mean, how many Jews are left in Plock, which I think is the birthplace of Ben Gurion, by the way. But even where they didn't participate, they saw people murdered in front of their eyes. And Michael Steinlaus written a book called Bondage to the Dead, where he argues that witnessing traumas of this sort also have a very bad effect. So this is a process which is going to take a long time. But what's very depressing about the present situation is to say all Poles were involved in mass murder is obviously wrong. On the other hand, to say no Poles were involved in mass murder, the Poles only, this is what, for instance, Czarnek, the Minister of Education, said yesterday. You can read it. I don't know if it was reported in the New York Times. If it's reported in the London Times, you know that the stuff is around. You can go online on the London Times and you can find Czarnek's statement where he says the Jews survived because we helped them. It's not the case. I mean, the number of Jews who survived in Poland, it's a disputed question, but after the Second World War, the main Polish Jewish organization was called the Central Committee of Polish Jews. And it asked people to register with it immediately after the war. In July 1945, immediately after liberation, about 74,000 people registered with it. Of them, there were 16,000 who had been hidden on the Aryan side. In some cases, they weren't hidden by anybody. They had documents. They were able to pass as Poles. But we're talking about, if we take this as the figure as people who were hidden by Poles, it's obviously too low because there were many people who didn't wish to reveal after the Second World War, particularly people who had taken on a new identity, that they were Jewish. If you treble it, you get 50,000 people. If you quadruple it, you get 65,000 people. To do, I mean, some of the apologists in Poland say it should be multiplied by 10. This is ridiculous. But even if we bring it up to 65,000 and say 3 Poles are required to save each one of these, we have 150,000 people in a country, in 35 million of which 25 million were Poles. So it is a marginal phenomenon. This doesn't mean that it isn't a phenomenon that people should admire. And I do understand this because I was involved in underground political activity in South Africa. And in 1960, there was the first major threat to the government in South Africa. And one of the people that I was involved with, somebody called Ben Turok, leading, I was never a member of the Communist Party because I thought they were too bureaucratized. You had to be asked to join them. I turned them down. Anyway, this Ben Turok phones me up, and we came from a fairly wealthy background. I had a car. I was 20. So he said, Antony, we need somebody to distribute leaflets in Soweto. Will you come and pick these up, and I'll give you the places where you have to drop them on. I said, Ben, I've now got my scholarship to go to Oxford. If I do this, the chances of my being arrested are at least 50%. I'm sorry, but I'm just not going to do this. So when people say, you know, I don't understand why people didn't offer assistance to Jews when the penalty was death, because the penalty for me wasn't death. I do understand this. But I mean, the problem is that we need a complicated history which accepts that the past is not only the record of the wonderful things that have done by people which show what a great people we are, which is how the Morawiecki's and the Czarneks see the world. I think Duda, the president, is a little different. His speech was rather more nuanced. And, you know, I would like to see the opposition come to power. And the opposition is not, I mean, it's not like Hungary. The opposition is a significant force. Why the opposition is not stronger than it is is a complicated question, which again, I haven't got time to go into, but I'll stop at that point and see what other questions people want to raise.
Yeah, Anthony, if I had a few questions. I don't know if anybody wants to chime in on this. It's such a wonderful point you're bringing, which I have tried to communicate, that when we're dealing with American history, how much more complicated it is. Then they have these sweeping conclusions that everything's been guided by one particular principle or not. And as a historian, you've correctly pointed out that it's very complicated to highlight, the extent of help, why people were complicit, and all those factors here. But I want to ask you about whether this reaction now, which is clearly making headlines the last couple of years, and the problem, the tensions with Israel, how has it affected the Jewish population in Poland right now? Has there been an upsurge of anti-Semitism? What has been the response? Are Jews there afraid to speak out? What has been their involvement in this controversy? And what has also been the role of the Catholic Church here? Have they been a support, not a support? What is going on with those two?
That's yeah. Let me talk first about the reaction of the small Jewish community and of those people who are involved in the study of the Jewish past, like Barbara Engelking. I think that their reaction to what is going on is to become more aggressive in defending their position and more assertive. This is a very Polish attitude. I mean, Poles, have a history of insurrections in hopeless conditions. And one of the great Polish myths is, the myth of Samos, or a myth not in the sense that it didn't happen, but during the Napoleonic Wars, there was Napoleon had some Polish regiment fighting with him in Spain, and they fought in Samosierra in hopeless conditions. Similarly, the Poles were the people who took Monte Cassino with terrible losses. So the reaction has generally been one of defiance, and one in which people have taken a strong line. And this is illustrated in Barbara Engelking's reactions. If I were Barbara Engelking and I was on television, I would have put my views in a somewhat different way. I would have said that what we're trying to show in this exhibition is the following, and there are different conclusions which you can draw from it. And I would have put it in a more nuanced way. She was determined not to do that. She was provoked by the same thing that I was provoked by, this long catalogue of Poles who had helped Jews, which was feature of the ceremony on the Wednesday. She did the broadcast in the Wednesday evening. Was she right? I mean, that's another question, but that's the answer. On the question of the church, in the period of communism, the church was one of the main forces resisting communism, and the church was divided between what was called the open church and the closed church. The closed church was the church which saw secularization, Western influence, as the real threat to Poland. And this church has become stronger since the end of communism because obviously secularization has proceeded quite rapidly, and the number of people who go to church has diminished. The number of young people who don't want to have religious education in the schools has increased. So in response to this, as in the United States, the church has become more aggressive. There is also in the church an element which continues the tradition of the open church. One of the Bishop of Łódź, key figure in this, has just written a book which I was sent because I was asked if it should be translated and how it could be published in English. It's a book on the attitude of the church to the Jewish people, or to Judaism and the Jewish people, from the emergence of Christianity as an organized religion to the Reformation. What I said in response to the person who showed it to me, who's a leading Polish historian, a friend of mine, it's a very important book, but what we need is volume 2, which goes from the Reformation to the present day. But I mean, obviously, if he's written volume 1, he can write volume 2. But this does give some indication there are divisions. And I would say that a change in the position of the church would be very helpful, but the church feels threatened, and the reaction to the criticism of John Paul II is a good example. As you probably know, John Paul II is in the process of being beatified. Now, we don't believe in saints, and I mean, John Paul II certainly also beatified a lot of people. John Paul II, like every historical figure, has his good and his bad side. He was certainly the Pope who undermined communism, and he was a very courageous man. And I think he was somebody who generally believed, as he put it when he went to the synagogue in Rome, that Israel was our elder brother, a quotation which he took, I think, from St. Paul, but also from Mickiewicz, the great Polish romantic poet of the 19th century. But that he's a person with some faults, and that is also the case. But he's being used to push this resistance to secularization. And this is a conflict which isn't directly concerned with Jews, but does concern Jews to the extent that, as a Polish historian, she's partly Quebecois, Genevieve Zubrzycki has written, those people who are concerned with the revival of Jewish life, non-Jewish Poles, people who are involved with the museums and with the Jewish Cultural Festival and so on, see this as a way of diminishing the influence of the Catholic Church. And in some ways, those people who want to preserve a certain ultramontane Catholicism regard all these developments as negative. It's a conflict which has gone on in Poland, at least since the 1890s, between an outward-looking, pluralistic, multi-ethnic and multi-confessional Poland and an inward-looking, narrowly Catholic, anti-European Poland. And that conflict hasn't been resolved. And obviously, I'm in the favor of the first Poland, not the second. And although I'm a little unfair, I would say that the present government is really in favor of the second Poland, although there are some exceptions in it.
I next have a comment from Sandra Sosinski, which I will read out. My husband and I traveled to Poland 5 years ago. While I encountered no apparent anti-Semitism, I also could find no evidence of any Jewish life remaining. Yes, the new Museum of Jewish History exists in Warsaw, and it was important that we were able to see Auschwitz, where members of my family died. But frankly, I find no Jewish presence remaining in Poland at all. Chabad has a presence in Krakow that is imposed from outside. And then she has a footnote saying that my grandfather was born in Polonsky. Fortunately, he came to the US in 1919. But her main comments are to hear your responses to the lack of Jewish presence in Poland that she could identify.
Well, if you don't look for it, you don't find it. I mean, we're going to meet, we're having a Sabbath dinner with Rabbi Michael Shudrich. Michael Shudrich is an American, trained at JTS, I think, who's been in Poland since 1985. I can't remember exactly when he first went there. And he's done a wonderful job in reviving Jewish life. He's a pluralistic individual, that is to say, his basic sympathy, I think, is with conservative Judaism, but because the community is too small, he has allowed the emergence of a Reform community, but he tries to create an Orthodox community which is inclusive and encourages conversion. And I mean, he's taken a very liberal line on a lot of matters. Just to give one foolish example, one of the principal people responsible for the preservation of Jewish monuments in Poland is an architect, or was an architect, called Jan Jagielski, who used to work at the Jewish Historical Institute. Jagielski had no Jewish connections, but he was totally committed to the preservation of Jewish monuments. And when he died, he expressed the view that he wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. And although there would have been problems over this, Michael Shudrich insisted that he was. So there's a lot of Warsaw there's an active, I wouldn't call it Orthodox, but normative Jewish community around Shudrich. And then there's a smaller Beit Warszawa, a Reformed community, which is also flourishing and which one would like to encourage. I mean, I suppose we are more Reformed than Orthodox. In Krakow, the same situation prevails. Rabbi Stewart has a friend there, Rabbi Tanya Siegel, who has been trying to develop the first woman rabbi in Poland, I think. There are all sorts of issues about being the first woman in Poland. I think she's now in Ostrava, which is in the Czech Republic rather than in Krakow, but she did a wonderful job in Krakow. Well, we'll find out when we're there. I mean, I'm not sure what the present situation is, but the main Jewish community in Krakow, the Orthodox community, is more problematic. And that's partly because, I hate to say it, because of the existence of Chabad. I mean, Chabad has got many good sides to it, but wherever you have Chabad, it creates problems. And I won't go into why, but this is certainly the case. But there are also smaller Jewish communities in Łódź and in Gdańsk. And there's also quite a lot of secular Jewish activity. Yiddish is very much promoted by the Polish Society for Yiddish Studies. Many of the people involved in the revival of Jewish life, as for instance, the people who have created the Krakow Jewish Festival, are not actually Jews, but a lot of Jews take part. And when it was still, I mean, you know, the situation in Eastern Europe today is not what it might be, but the Krakow Jewish Festival attracted a lot of Jews from Ukraine, because you could travel from Kiev or Lviv and participate in this. The number of Jews in Ukraine is, again, a somewhat disputed subject. Rabbi Stewart's a greater expert on this than me. But I mean, certainly there were at least 100 and probably 200,000 people with some Jewish connection. And they were very much influenced by what was happening in Poland. And there is a certain amount of contact between the Jews in places like Ukraine, Belarus, also a problematic issue, Russia. These things are adversely affected, but the Polish Jewish community is able to function, and because it's Poland is really not yet under that sort of control. And I mean, one can only express great admiration for the efforts which have been made to revive Jewish life. Huge efforts have been made, and they've been largely, I mean, given the small size of the community, they've been remarkable.
We're going to experience that.
Yes. Dr. Polonsky, thank you so much once again for your superb presentation. I'm now going to turn the floor to Rabbi Altshuler to thank you.
Well, I'm honored again with this tremendous presentation, and you certainly have opened up for our group coming there a load of issues that we're going to continue discussing about how we deal with history, how we relate to Poland. I'm sure there'll be times where we're going to be very frustrated and confused and all that, but it's good. It's all part of the learning experience here, and we're going to come back with a great deal of information and learning that we're going to share with the rest of the community. And there's no one better to guide us in all of this, as you have opened up this tremendous conversation, than you, Antony. And I want to thank you for, again, an incredible hour. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I just say, I mean, I just like to say, I mean, I understand Sandra Soshinsky's position. I haven't got time really to reply now, but in public, what I would say is, you need to go to the JCC in Krakow and in Warsaw. These are the most vibrant organizations. The JCC in Warsaw and the Toby Foundation in Warsaw has done a lot, and I hope we'll be able to go and see what they're doing. And the same is true in Krakow. They built this very impressive building, and Jonathan Ornstein, who's the director, you're right, he's an American, but I mean, he went back, so is Michael Schudrich. But I mean, you know, I went to Poland from South Africa. I mean, I don't think that this means that I'm less. I mean, I'm more Lithuanian than Polish, but I feel perfectly comfortable in Poland and perfectly happy to participate. And there's a lot going on, and more than you saw.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll now call on Al Chardell, our Vice President. Al?
Thank you. Professor Polonsky, on behalf of Congregation Beth Shalom, I'd like to thank you for this incredible presentation. We're so lucky to have great scholars like yourself visiting us through the magic of Zoom to share their wisdom with us. Just as a bit of an aside, I was in Poland with March of the Living when the president of Poland and part of his cabinet went down in Russia. And at the time,
2010, yes.
Yeah, and at the time there was some anxiety on parts of the Jewish community who we interfaced with as to what might happen. So you brought back to me a memory that I had forgotten about for quite a while. So I need to also extend to you, first of all, we're very, very jealous of all of those folks who are going on this trip. to Poland and Lithuania, and they're going to be able to have you for a large period of time to expand upon all of the things you spoke about today and to be able to hear even more incredible information. I would love to be able to again extend to you another invitation, if you would, to join us again sometime next year to share more of the great amounts of knowledge and information that you've been able to amass. And finally, I'd like to extend special thanks to both Rabbi Altshuler and to Eric Ferber for all their special efforts throughout the year to make this Scholars program such a tremendous success. Our Distinguished Speaker Series is one of the great high points of our education and programming throughout the year. So they also deserve our tremendous thanks. And please, you know what? The weather here is very, very pleasant in Sarasota. You might want to consider visiting us sometime in person.
Well, I've been in Florida, and yes, I'd love to come. Oh, no, absolutely, on another occasion. And thank you. I mean, there's so much one could say. If one wants one explanation for why things went wrong in Poland, it was actually the plane crash in Smolensk and the fact that Lech Kaczynski, who was a very moderate figure, was replaced effectively by his twin brother, Yaroslav Kaczynski, who's a much more hardline figure, but that's a different story.
I also want to thank Al for his continued support of for both Eric and myself, and all the wonderful support he brings for Jewish learning and education. So thank you, Al, on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Al. Dr. Polonsky, I echo Al's comments, and it's always a standing invitation for you to come to Florida any month of the year to come and address us personally. And if that's not possible, at least on Zoom, to have you as a regular presenter. So,
well, with pleasure. It's a great pleasure.
You always raise the bar every time we hear you speak.
Yes.
I want to thank Rabbi Altshuler for being the catalyst in making this all possible. And for those of us who are going on the trip, we look forward to being with both of you. Once again, we thank Al, who initiated the Distinguished Speaker Series, which has been enormously successful. I want to thank